So this is the last day I'm going to deal with Chantal Mouffe's book, The Return of the Political, but this is arguably the most important video because I'm going to talk about what Mouffe really wants. She's going to give us a vision of what she wants, and actually that's what we want the most, right, out of thinkers who oftentimes spend more time critiquing than they do envisioning a future. But Mouffe does do some of that. And so let's just remember what she wants. She wants three things which don't even seem to go together in the eyes of a lot of people. She wants a, quote, radical plural democracy. She wants enough liberalism to guarantee rights and to retain the private sphere, although she wants more interaction between public and private. She sees it as a spectrum. And the public always penetrates the private sphere and the private the public. But she wants liberalism without individualism, meaning the tendency that we have to become, a religion of one, a government of one, sort of retreating into our own opinions, or even just retreating completely into our private life, and therefore becoming more than self-interested, but selfish in the sense that, we're not aware of what's going on with other people and other groups in the public. So she wants what she sees as the good part of liberalism without the bad part, and I'll get more into that in a bit. And then she introduces that she also wants socialism, which wouldn't come as a surprise to you if you've learned anything about Mouffe and Leclerc already. And so what I want to talk about today is particularly Mouffe's idea for a type of socialism, okay? Now, just another reminder, she's incorporated the thought of Schmidt, but largely in the negative, all right? However, she does agree with Karl Schmidt on several things. First of all, his critique of liberalism as being inherently anti-political. Liberalism at its core was invented to stop people from arguing, okay? And so, representation, for instance, although it could be good in the liberal framework, was put in place to distance the public from the ultimate decisions. Liberalism as an Enlightenment ideology envisioned that if people became educated enough and understood their self-interest well enough, that they could deliberate together in these representative bodies, perhaps, and would find agreement. And part of the reason there would be agreement is because liberalism said, we'll put all of the hot button issues that people seem to care about the most into that private sphere. Okay, so really the thrust of liberalism is to stop people from killing each other over things that they care about. And that has some very beneficial effects. However, it really kind of like takes the blood right out of politics. Okay, so she agrees that liberalism has this anti-political effect. It doesn't therefore encourage people to be actual citizens or care about something larger than themselves. She also agrees with Schmidt that people are inherently political. And so if a system doesn't recognize that and deal with that somehow, it's gonna go astray. It's going to suppress that, and it's going to come out in some other way. For Schmidt, he says this is because we are friend-enemy creatures, right? There will always be friends and enemies in our minds. This is how we associate, and there's not much that can be done about that. Therefore, politics needs to channel that effectively. Mouffe agrees with that. Also, Schmidt said that the state in a liberal setting had become totalizing or managerial, okay? That the more that people become atomized individuals, in this liberal mindset, demand that their rights be heard and be respected, the more they turn to government to rely on it, to take care of problems, and to defend an ever-growing list of rights. This managerial government, as it becomes bigger, necessarily gets in the way of any sort of real political participation, and people become used to being sort of managed and taken care of. So Mouffe agrees with that, okay? But here's where she disagrees. Schmidt said that you couldn't have real popular government that, was about the people and expressed the people's will without cultural and social homogeneity, okay? And he argued that we should, in effect, get rid of liberalism entirely, including representation. So Mouffe would keep more of liberalism. Schmidt would get rid of it pretty much entirely, okay? All right, now, why is Mouffe so certain about this? Well, she, has the advantage of living through the times of, the rise of the aftermath of Nazism and fascism, the rise of totalitarian communism, and now neoliberal capitalism. And she understands that, that canceling representation and getting rid of the people's ability to express themselves and to have some sort of direct impact on government are dangerous moves. Downplaying individual rights is a dangerous move. If people don't have recourse to appeal from all-powerful government, there will be problems. Okay, emphasizing homogeneity, whether it's racial in nature or whether it's ideological in nature, is also a very dangerous move. So this is why she thinks that we need to retain some liberalism. And I find this point very convincing. I don't think any of us want to go back to totalitarian fascism or communism. And so the question then is, how do we kind of like avoid these horrendous pitfalls while still, basically embracing some of what she thinks of as true from Schmidt's argument. Okay. Well, she proposes that we can combine liberalism with socialism and that we can inject a lot more democracy within that framework as well, okay? Now, that is problematic. For instance, Marx famously rejected a socialism that was combined with old liberal institutions because he thought whenever people, for instance, voted for representatives, what they were really doing was voting for one representative of capitalism versus another, one demagogue versus another, and that they wouldn't actually have their needs met or their interests recognized, okay? So it would be better, and this is what he predicted would happen, for the people to take over and to actually manage what would be the state, which would then sort of eventually melt away because you wouldn't need to have any sort of top-down power. And eventually you would have people managing all of the functions that the state did better, and you'd have them also cooperatively managing all of the enterprises in society. Well, that did not happen in actual Soviet or Chinese or any other communism, of course. That vision didn't happen, and we got a confirmation of the need for some procedural rights and ways of expressing ourselves within the system, not just sort of relying upon human nature to change and for everybody to just simply cooperate together. So enter Noberto Bobbio, okay? This is a person I'd never heard of before. I wondered, though, if I have the time later this summer, I might look and see how much he was inspired by Bakunin, who was more of an anarchist, communist, who opposed Marx in some respects, well, in a lot of respects. And I know Bakunin's ideas were quite attractive to Italian socialists at a certain point, and Bobbio's thought seems to kind of resonate to a certain extent with Bakunin. So she goes to this place for inspiration, Bobbio, okay? And I've just listed some quotes there because through them we can see, what she draws from this thinker. She says, he has consistently advanced the thesis that socialist goals could be realized within the framework of liberal democracy, and indeed that they could only be realized within that framework. So Bobbio then is one of the first thinkers to try to meld liberalism and democracy and socialism. He defends representative democracy as the only adequate one for our modern complex societies and dismisses the call for direct democracy made by some radical Democrats. Okay, so he's in favor of representation. So automatically we're thinking, well, didn't we just hear an argument against representation? Well, yes, but Bobbio's notion of how people will be represented is quite different. Again, she says only a liberal state can guarantee the basic rights, freedom of opinion, of expression, of speech, of assembly, of association, and these are the good things that come from the liberal state that should be kept. Okay, here's a couple of things that Bobbio said that Mouffe definitely agrees with, and I agree with as well. He thought that democracy in his day was being undermined by increasing bureaucracy, technical rationality, and mass society. Government was getting bigger. The bureaucrats who were the experts who could manage things without any sort of democratic input were, those bureaucrats and bureaucracies were growing. They were employing technical rationality, dividing every task into discrete parts and dealing with it as efficiently as possible, which guarantees that the experts would rule and not the ordinary citizens. And mass society, comes about through more and more mass communications, more and more capitalism, as capitalism kind of lifts people up into quasi-consumerism. More and more they begin to imitate and to want to fit in and to become more homogenous in the way that they think. And all of this, Bobbio said, led to a less active democracy. So such a democracy was in name only at a certain point. So the result of these trends, he said, were invisible power structures and oligarchies who actually ruled, low actual participation of individuals, all right, in the political process, and uneducated citizens, because citizens are more and more educated simply to fit into an economic role, but not into a citizenship role. Well, we know those are points that kind of resonate with communitarians too, and I definitely agree with those points, okay? So what he proposed and what Mouffe picks up on and advocates here is democracy in associations, okay? So here's a quote from Mouffe. The central factor is not the emergence of a new type of democracy, but a process, and this is quoting Bobbio, in which quite traditional forms of democracy, such as representative democracy, are infiltrating new spaces occupied until now by hierarchic or bureaucratic organizations. All right, so that's kind of a general statement, and Mouffe doesn't go into a lot of examples and particulars, so we have to use our imagination a bit. I would love it if I got more detail out of this part of the book, but we don't. She points out that currently individualism stands in the way of this extension of democracy, but I would say in addition to that, or maybe we would have to generalize individualism and make it into a lot of things, but chief among the reasons why this would be blocked are economic interests. So if we want to say that those are, those are a product of individualism, fine. But, what we're talking about here, I think, is something like, okay, for instance, workplace democracy, and actually like workers owning the various enterprises they work at, right? Owning them and running them. Yugoslavia tried something like this in their experiment with communism, workplace management by workers. I don't know if that's exactly where she's going with this. So at this point, we can glean Mouffe's aspirations. She wants a society in which people are represented with and through various associations of which they are a part. And we know that for each person, there are many identities shifting and changing. There are many different orientations shifting and changing. And so a person is a member of, let's say, multiple associations which are meaningful to them for one reason or another. So this would play out, for instance, maybe in workers in various industries owning and governing themselves. All right, but it might also play out in various identity groups represented in the larger political process, in so much as they experience that identity. That seems to be what she's getting at with, trying to form coalitions around people who experience different identities, but experience a common subordination or common experience anyway of subordination. It might include government functions that are run by workers and citizens. So think about how much would have to change and how drastically that would have to change in order for this to happen. Literally, capitalists would have to get out of the way. So, like the people who own the corporations, the banks, the stores, the this and that, all of them would have to somehow step aside. Now, the reason I point out the obvious is because it is like the missing link. And it's so in a lot of theories, right? In a way, lots of theories sound good until you get to this point where you ask yourself, how are we going to get there? Okay. In this case, the change is quite drastic. And the people who would oppose it are quite strong. And so, I doubt if this could happen via the liberal democratic process that Mouffe wants to keep at least part of, okay? Maybe it would have to happen through some sort of popular uprising of some kind, or maybe it could happen piecemeal. I kind of like that option. It would never be fully available, though. But I suppose I could see people within the liberal democratic system deciding that they were going to collectively own and operate certain elements, or within their local government finding a way to assert themselves and to become more a part of the process of running the various divisions in it. But to have a whole society follow this blueprint would require some upheaval, I would think. Now, also, she does address the question, in the process of doing this, if we could have these this type of association socialism, what would that do to our individual, not just our individual rights, but our individual experience, right? Like our ability to feel free to kind of like be ourselves apart from these various associations. Well, there's that bedrock, liberal sense of rights that she wants to retain. And, she says for that reason, and also because if we didn't have some sort of overarching government, and all we had was these various associations trying to self-govern, we'd have too much chaos, but we'd certainly have like people's rights being violated. And so there's a need for a government that can enforce individual rights and can kind of referee whatever the process is for these associations to, deliberate and and negotiate and eventually come to at least temporary agreements. There's a lot of things that aren't laid out here. You know, what would a legislature look like under this more association-based democracy? How would the deliberation take place? Would it take place amongst representatives of these various associations? Or would somehow everybody be included? Would the democracy mainly be experienced by most individuals at the very local level, in which they can all really voice, you know, how things should be done? Or would there be some way for them to experience democratic power as we move up, you know, towards that national government? I don't see that spelled out anywhere, which is not unusual, but it is disconcerting because, you know, such change is necessary, that I think people would want to have some information about, you know, how do you go from right where we are now to there? What are the intermediate steps? So, you know, in reading this book, I asked the question, is it possible? And some of my concerns have already been voiced, but another concern I have is that Mouffe's idea of associational socialism, or however you want to put it, would require everybody in these associations, maybe particularly in the workplace, to be truly involved and want to be. Now, you might argue that liberalism has conditioned the self to be very inward, right? Christopher Lasch, you know, pointed out that we live in a narcissistic society at this point, right? The individual, you know, cocoons and withdraws and thinks of himself as somebody who contracts to work, say, 8 hours a day and receives a paycheck. And the main reason for being at work is to get that paycheck. And he's not necessarily immediately going to be interested in becoming a workplace citizen, even if that really is a reality, as opposed to the fake stuff that happens now, where you get consulted but nobody listens. So that's a big hurdle too, to get people to the point where they want to have interactions with others at that level, in their workplace, in their neighborhoods, in local government. Arguably they could, but it would be particularly difficult now because we're dealing with citizens who are conditioned not to want to not care, and to be very much about, you know, moving into their private personal zone out space when they want to, because really it's the only place where people have any peace in a society like this. And now, you know, in this associational democracy / socialism, you'd have people in your face all the time, and you'd be in their face, right? That would take some getting used to. In fact, maybe that's the place to start, is, I mean, how do you take that first step? Maybe you try it, maybe at the local level, if there's enough people interested in taking over a particular government task more fully, right? But anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. I think this is very difficult to imagine, but I kind of like the idea nonetheless, and I guess I'd be interested to hear what some of you thought about its plausibility, and what you thought might actually take us from here to there, if you do like it. And if you don't like it, why? Because I can think, you know, I've mentioned a few reasons why I'm a little bit leery. You know, it's one thing to sort of like the idea in the abstract. It's another thing to think about what would happen in reality with this, and not to mention, is it possible to get there? All right, so I'll look forward to hearing from you, and Next time, I think we will have an interview with a colleague of mine. It might be a two-part interview going over 2 weeks span. So you can look forward to that. We ranged all over the place.